The gate groaned like a dying ox, and Gideon Sutton threw his shoulder against the crossbeam for the third time, knowing it would not hold much longer. Fire climbed the timbers above him, orange tongues licking at the old oak the whole town had sworn would stand another 100 years. Somewhere behind him a man screamed and then did not scream again. The night smelled of pitch smoke and blood, and the wet iron tang of a battle that had already been lost. Down. A voice roared beside him, and he dropped without thinking, without even knowing whose voice it was until the war axe passed a hand's width above his skull and buried itself in the chest of the orc raider, who had been about to open his throat. Snaga Ironhide planted her boot on the dying raider's ribs and wrenched her axe free in the same motion, and for one heartbeat, in the hell light of the burning gatehouse, Gideon saw her clearly. Blood slicked one side of her face, not her own by the look of the wound beneath it. Some other man's or orc's spent life painted across her jaw. Her dark leather cuirass, banded tight with iron rivets down the ribs, was scored in 3 long gashes that had not quite bitten deep enough to kill her. Her braided black hair had come half undone and hung in ropes around her shoulders, and her tusks, when she bared her teeth at the raider falling behind her, gleamed white against the smoke. "Sutton," she barked, "the gate will not hold. We hold the breach instead." "There is no we, Ironhide, there is barely a me," he shouted back, hauling his old sellsword blade free of the scabbard he had not drawn it from in 3 years, the leather stiff, his hand remembering the weight before his mind caught up. "Where is Captain Hale?" Her silence answered him before her words did. "Dead, on the wall stair. I could not reach him in time." The words hit harder than any blow the night had dealt him. Rowan Hale, who had shared his last barrel of cider with Gideon not 4 days past, who had laughed and said the wall had stood 40 years and would stand 40 more, who had trusted the truce the way a man trusts the sun to rise. Gideon had no time to grieve him. A raider came screaming out of the smoke with a cleaver raised, and Gideon met him with a parry that jarred his arm to the shoulder, and Snaga's axe came around and finished what his sword had started. "Back to back," she said, already turning so her spine pressed to his. "You watch what I cannot, I watch what you cannot. Do not die, Sutton. I have not decided yet if I like you enough to avenge you." Even here, even now, there was a wicked spark in her voice, and it was that spark more than anything that steadied his hands. They fought like that for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than a few brutal minutes, turning as one creature with 2 blades, the little courtyard of the gatehouse littered with the bodies of the wall's dead. Human soldiers who had eaten breakfast with him. Orc wall wardens who had traded jokes with Snaga not a week before. All of it gone in a single moondark night, because somewhere out past the tree line, a warband calling itself the Bloodfang had decided the old truce was a chain and not a covenant, and had come to break it with fire. A raider vaulted the shattered gate, huge, tusked, a scar cutting his face in half, and roared a name that made Snaga's whole body go rigid against Gideon's back. "Mordrek Skarn," she hissed. "The Bloodfang chief himself, come to spit on the treaty his own grandfather signed." "Ironhide," the huge orc bellowed, delighted, cruel. "Last dog of the Stonejoe guarding human bones, come and die with the rest of your borrowed pack." "Come and try to make me," Snaga snarled back, and surged forward before Gideon could stop her, axe singing. He would remember the next span of time only in pieces for the rest of his life. The clash of her axe against Mordrek's cleaver, sparks raining off tempered iron. The way she took a blow across the shoulder that would have felled a lesser fighter and only staggered, roaring, and answered it with a strike that opened the raider chief's forearm to the bone. The way Gideon himself waded in against 2 lesser raiders trying to flank her, his old instincts waking up all at once, muscle memory from a decade of sellsword contracts he had sworn he was done with forever. He killed a man that night. He had killed men before in another life and had promised himself he never would again, and he did it anyway because the alternative was watching Snaga Ironhide die alone in a burning courtyard, and some part of him, some part he did not yet have words for, found that thought unbearable. Mordrek's scarn broke off the duel when a horn sounded, far off in the black trees, low and mournful, a Stonejo patrol horn answering the fires they must have seen from their own ridgeline. The raider chief spat blood at Snaga's feet. "The wall is broken," he said, "and broken things do not mend. Enjoy your ashes, Ironhide." Then he was gone, his warband melting back into the tree line like smoke drawn up a chimney, leaving the gatehouse of the ashwall a smoking ruin, and its dead scattered across the frost-hard ground. Gideon stood in the sudden, ringing silence, chest heaving, sword slick and heavy in his hand, and understood with a cold and terrible clarity that when the sun rose, he and the orc woman breathing hard beside him would be the only two people left alive who had stood a watch on this wall that night. The dawn came gray and merciless, and it showed them everything the darkness had been kind enough to hide. Gideon walked the length of the courtyard with his sword still in his hand because he had forgotten in his numbness that he was still holding it. 12 human soldiers, 6 orc wall wardens, Captain Rowan Hale, found at the foot of the stair exactly where Snaga had said he would be, his sword still in his hand, his eyes open to a sky he would never see again. Gideon knelt beside him for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would matter to a dead man, and closed his friend's eyes with 2 fingers that would not quite stop shaking. Snaga Ironhide stood at the shattered gate, surveying the wreckage with an expression Gideon could not read, something carved from stone and old grief both. In the gray light he could see her properly for the first time since the fighting had started. She was tall, taller than him by a head, built with the dense, coiled strength of a woman who had trained with a blade since before she could walk steady, her green-gray skin marked here and there with old scars that spoke of a life spent at the sharp edge of the world. Her leather cuirass, laced tight from waist to collarbone and banded in dark iron across the ribs, clung to a frame that was as beautiful as it was dangerous, and beneath it she wore snug leather leggings tucked into high boots, a warrior's garb through and through, cut close so that nothing would snag a blade or slow a step. Even bloodied, even exhausted, there was something in the proud set of her shoulders that made it plain she had never once in her life considered herself anything less than a match for whatever the world sent at her. "They will blame me," she said, without turning. "What?" "The town." She nodded toward the smoke rising over the rooftops of Thornwatch beyond the ridge. "A wall falls, and orcs did the falling, and I am the only orc left standing in the wreckage. Men do not need much more reason than that." Gideon opened his mouth to argue, and found he could not, because he had lived long enough among frightened, grieving people to know she was almost certainly right. "I will not let them," he said instead, and meant it more fiercely than he expected to. Snaga looked at him then, really looked, her dark eyes moving over his soot-streaked face as though weighing the truth of him on some private scale. "You are an orchard man, Sutton, not a lord, not a captain. What weight do you think your word carries?" "More than you think," he said. "I used to carry a different kind of weight. I remember how." Something shifted behind her eyes, not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of a question she had not expected to be asking. Before she could answer, the sound of many boots on the frost-hard road announced the arrival of Thornwatch itself, come to see what the smoke meant, and the true trouble of that terrible morning was only beginning. The town of Thornwatch had been built in the shadow of the ash wall for 3 generations, ever since the Ironwood truce had ended the last great war between the border clans and the frontier settlements, and in all that time it had never once seen its garrison slaughtered in a single night. The crowd that came up the road numbered near 60, farmers and tradesmen and the magistrate himself, Corwin Ash, a narrow, gray-bearded man who had inherited both his office and his suspicion of orcs from a father who had fought in that old war. When they saw the gate in ruins and the bodies laid out under whatever cloaks could be found, a low, terrible sound went through them, grief curdling fast into fury, and every eye in that crowd found Snaga Ironhide standing alone at the broken gate and did not look away again. "There she is," someone shouted, a voice thick with the kind of hate that needs no more evidence than a green hide to feed on. The only one of them left breathing. "You tell me that is chance." "She fought for us," Gideon said, stepping forward, putting himself between the crowd and the wall warden before he had even decided to do it. "She fought until dawn. I was there. I saw her take wounds that should have killed 3 men trying to save this gate. Or trying to make sure her own kind got through it." Another voice snapped, and a young farmhand near the front hefted a hay fork like it was a spear, his knuckles white. Magistrate Ash raised a hand for quiet, though his own eyes were hard as flint on Snaga's face. "Orc," he said, "you will surrender your weapons and answer for what happened here, or so help me the militia will make you answer another way." Snaga did not so much as flinch. She planted the head of her axe in the frozen ground and folded both arms across her chest, and when she spoke, her voice carried the flat, unhurried calm of a woman who had faced down worse threats than a frightened crowd with pitchforks. "I fought under the Ironwood truce as wall warden of the Stonejaw clan, sworn to this gate the same as your Captain Hale was sworn to it. I watched him die trying to hold that oath. I have not slept, I have not eaten, and I have killed 6 raiders with my own hands defending your town, and you will accuse me of burning it. Very well. Come and take my axe then. Come and see how that goes for the first man brave enough to try." The crowd shifted uneasily, no one quite willing to be that first man, and it was in that ugly, trembling silence that Gideon Sutton did the thing that would change the whole shape of his life. He stepped fully between Snaga and the mob, sword still sheathed at his hip, and spread his hands, palms out, toward the men and women he had lived among for 3 years since he had hung up his old contracts and bought his little orchard on the edge of town. "I fought at her back all night," he said, loud enough to carry to the rear of the crowd. "I am Gideon Sutton, and some of you remember what I did before I planted apple trees. I have seen plenty of men lie about their courage in a battle they never stood in. I am not lying now. This woman held that gate when everyone else who could have held it was already dead. If you want to put a rope around someone's neck this morning, you had best find a Bloodfang raider first, because the only warrior who kept Thornwatch from burning to its foundations is standing right here, and I will put my body between her and any man who raises a hand against her." The silence that followed was different from the first, thinner, uncertain. Magistrate Ash's jaw worked, torn between the fear that had built his authority and the plain, unwelcome truth of a burned gate and an orchard man willing to stake his own life on a stranger's honor. "The Truce Council must decide this," Ash said at last, grudging, "not a mob on a road. Ironhide, you will remain under watch until the envoy arrives from Stonejaw territory to speak for you. Sutton, if you vouch for her, you vouch for her with your own life. Are those terms you understand?" "I understand them," Gideon said. Snaga turned her head and looked at him, and for the second time that morning something moved behind her dark eyes that had not been there before, something that was not quite gratitude, because pride like hers did not bend easily to gratitude, but was close enough to its cousin that Gideon felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. To understand how Gideon Sutton had come to stand in that road with his life staked on an orc woman's honor, it helps to know what kind of man he had been before the apple trees. He had spent 11 years as a sellsword working the caravan roads and border skirmishes of the frontier, hired first by merchants who needed a strong arm against bandits, then by minor lords who needed a strong arm against each other, until the work had worn something essential out of him, some belief he had once held that the causes he bled for were worth the blood. He had watched too many friends die for coin that meant nothing to the men who paid it, and after a battle in the southern passes that he still would not speak of to anyone, he had walked away from the mercenary life entirely, bought 40 acres of half-wild land on the very edge of Thornwatch's boundary, where the forest pressed close against the last fence line, and planted apple trees because, he told himself, an apple tree asked nothing of a man but patience, and did not ask him to kill anyone to earn its fruit. For 3 years that had been enough. He tended his orchard, sold cider and pressed apples at the Thornwatch market, and kept mostly to himself, a man well-liked but rarely truly known, the kind of quiet, capable presence a town takes for granted until it is gone. His nearest neighbor across the tree line was the ash wall itself, and it was there, hauling barrels of cider up to trade with the garrison, that he had first met Snaga Ironhide, 18 months before the siege that would end so many lives. She had been standing atop the wall's earthworks the first time he saw her, testing the balance of a new axe against a straw dummy with such ferocious, controlled violence that he had stopped his cart entirely just to watch. When she noticed him staring, she had not looked away or covered herself with false modesty, only planted the axe in the dummy's chest and called down, "Orchard man, have you come to trade or to gawk?" "Both, if you will let me," he had called back, and she had laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and that had been the start of it. What grew between them after that was not courtship, not at first. It was rivalry, sharp and delighted, the kind that only exists between two people who each secretly suspect the other might actually be their equal. She mocked his rusty sword arm until he offered to prove it was not so rusty, and they had sparred in the yard behind the gatehouse with wooden practice blades, while half the garrison placed bets on the outcome. And she had beaten him soundly the first 4 times and by the barest margin the 5th, and had grinned at him afterward with something fierce and pleased in her eyes that he had not been able to stop thinking about for a week. It became a habit, then a tradition. Every fortnight when he brought his cider up to trade, they found some new contest to settle between them. Axe throwing at a knot in an old stump, arm wrestling across a barrel head while soldiers cheered, a foot race along the top of the wall that she won by a stride and never once let him forget. He learned that she was a wall warden of the Stonejo clan, one of the peaceful clans who had signed and kept the Ironwood truce for 3 generations, sent to serve at the joint garrison because her chief trusted her judgment above any other warriors. She learned that he had once been paid to kill men for lords who never remembered his name, and that he had traded that life for an orchard because he wanted, more than anything, to build something instead of ending it. "You are wasted on apples, Sutton," she had told him once, watching him lose an arm-wrestling match with poor Grace. "You still fight like a man who remembers being good at it." "Maybe I like apples better than fighting," he had said. "Maybe," she had allowed, "but I have watched you during storm drills when the horn sounds and every soldier scrambles. You do not scramble. You go still and you watch, and you count the ways a thing could go wrong before it happens. That is not an orchard man's habit. That is a soldier's habit that never quite left you." He had not known what to say to that, because it was true, and no one else in Thornwatch had ever looked at him closely enough to notice. It was in those 18 months of rivalry and trade and half-serious contests that something had begun to change beneath the surface of things, though neither of them had named it yet. He found himself timing his trips to the wall for days he knew she would be on duty. She found herself, though she would not have admitted it aloud to any living soul, watching for his cart on the road long before it crested the hill. The night of the siege had broken all of that open at once, the way fire breaks open a green log too stubborn to catch any other way. The truce envoy arrived from Stonejo territory 4 days after the siege, a broad-shouldered old orc named Griswin Deepwood who had known Snaga since she was a girl learning to hold an axe too large for her hands, and who listened to the whole account of that terrible night with a face carved from patience and old sorrow. He walked the ruined gatehouse with Magistrate Ash at his side, the two of them an odd and wary pair, human suspicion and orc grief circling each other like wolves deciding whether to fight or to hunt together. "The Bloodfang have broken the Ironwood truce," Griswin said finally, standing amid the wreckage of the gate. "Not Stonejo, not any clan bound by honor to this treaty. Mordrek Skarn has wanted war for a decade, and now he has the spark to light it if we let this fire spread instead of stamping it out here at this wall, before it reaches every border town from here to the mountains. Then what do you propose?" Ash asked, arms folded, still wary but listening now in a way he had not been listening days before. "The wall must be rebuilt," Griswin said, "and rebuilt visibly by human and orc hands working side by side, so that every eye on both sides of this border can see that the truce still stands, that Mordrek's fire did not end it. Snaga Ironhide will oversee the rebuilding as wall warden, as she was sworn to do before the siege ever came. If Thornwatch will not accept her, I will take her home to Stonejaw territory this very day, and you may explain to the next generation why the last warrior who defended you was driven off by the very town she bled for." Every eye in the small gathering turned to Gideon, because it was known by now, all through Thornwatch, that he had staked his own name on hers in the road that first terrible morning. "She stays," Gideon said before Ash could speak. "I will work the wall myself. I know stonework, I know timber framing. I spent enough years building fortifications for lords who never thanked me for it. Let her stay and oversee the rebuilding, and let me be the first hand that helps her raise it." Griswin studied him for a long moment, something knowing and faintly amused moving behind his old eyes. "You are fond of her," he said, not quite a question. "I respect her," Gideon said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and by the small, sharp glance Snaga cut toward him from across the ruined courtyard, he suspected she had heard the gap between those two things just as clearly as he had. Magistrate Ash, cornered by grief and practicality both, finally gave a stiff nod. "Rebuild it, then. Under watch, under my authority, but rebuild it. Thornwatch cannot stand without that gate, truce or no truce." And so it was decided, in the smoke-stained ruin of the ash wall, that Snaga Ironhide would stay, and that Gideon Sutton would stand beside her while she did it, and neither of them yet understood how completely that decision would remake the both of them. The rebuilding began 3 days later, and it was slower, harder, more grinding work than either of them had expected, and it was in the long, grueling weeks of it that something molten finally began to move between them. They quarried stone from the old riverbed a mile downhill and hauled it up by ox cart, Gideon driving the team, while Snaga walked alongside with a rope over one shoulder, hauling her own share of the load with a strength that made the oxen look almost decorative. They felled timber from the forest's edge, close enough to Bloodfang territory that every axe stroke echoed with the memory of what had happened the last time anyone had grown careless near that tree line, and they took turns keeping watch while the other worked, an old habit from the siege that neither of them ever formally agreed to, but both simply understood. The work itself became its own kind of courtship, though it took Gideon longer than it should have to recognize it as such. There was a particular morning, weeks into the rebuilding, when he was struggling to set a lintel stone into place above the new gate frame, sweat stinging his eyes, his arms shaking with the strain, and Snaga had simply stepped up beside him without a word, taken the other end of the stone, and lifted it into place as though it weighed no more than a loaf of bread. Their hands had brushed against the stone's rough edge in the settling of it, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as either might have a month before. "You did not need to help," he said, breathing hard, more from the moment than the effort. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." It was such a small thing, and yet he felt it land somewhere deep in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the noon sun overhead. Their old rivalry did not vanish. If anything, it sharpened, honed by the new intimacy of daily labor into something with an edge that made the air between them crackle. They argued over the best angle to set the new watchtower's beams, over whether the old drainage channel should be widened, over whose turn it was to cook the evening meal at the little fire they built each night near the half-raised wall, and every argument seemed to end not in resentment, but in something closer to hunger, a pull neither of them fully named but both of them felt. One evening, weeks into the work, with the new gate frame standing bare-boned against a bruised orange sunset, she challenged him again, the way she had a dozen times over their 18 months of easy rivalry, this time to a test of strength, lifting the great crossbeam that would eventually seal the gate. He lost badly, staggering under a weight she carried across the yard as though it were a fence post, and when she set it down and turned to gloat, as she always did, the words seemed to die in her throat. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something unguarded and raw, stripped of the easy banter they usually hid behind. "What," she said, wary now, "is that look, orchard man?" "I am trying to decide," he said slowly, "whether it is more foolish to say what I am thinking, or to keep saying nothing and let you go on believing I do not think it." Snaga set her hands on her hips, and though her voice stayed light, something in her stance had gone very still, very focused, the way she looked right before a duel. "Say it then. I have never known you to be a coward, Sutton. Do not start now." "I think about you when you are not standing in front of me," he said. "I have thought about you since before that gate ever burned. I think you are the strongest, most infuriating, most alive person I have ever stood beside. And some nights I lie awake in my orchard wondering if I imagine the way you looked at me across that stone this morning, because I cannot make sense of why a woman like you would ever look at a man like me that way." For a long moment, Snaga Ironhide said nothing at all, and the silence stretched so long that Gideon's stomach dropped, certain he had ruined something precious and fragile with too much honesty too soon. Then she crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, caught the front of his tunic in one strong fist, and kissed him with a fierceness that stole the breath clean out of his lungs, a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and stubbornness, and something achingly tender beneath the ferocity of it. When she finally pulled back, her forehead resting against his, her breath coming as unsteady as his own, she said, low and rough, "I have wanted to do that since the 4th time I beat you at wrestling and you laughed instead of sulking like every other man I have ever bested. Do not ask me why it took me this long. Orc women do not chase what they are not certain of." "And are you certain now?" he managed. "I am certain," she said, "that I have never once in my life let a rival walk away from me undefeated, Gideon Sutton, and I do not intend to start with you." He laughed, startled and helpless and happier than he had let himself feel in longer than he could remember, and kissed her again, and the half-built wall stood silent witness around them in the last light of that long, molten evening. What followed in the weeks after was not quiet, exactly, because nothing about Snaga Ironhide was ever quiet, but it was warm in a way Gideon had not known his life could hold room for. She came to him one night at his orchard cottage a fortnight later, having walked the mile from the wall camp alone in the dark, with no more concern for danger than a woman who trusted her own axe absolutely, and stood in his doorway with her braid unbound and her eyes very dark and very certain. "Among my people," she told him, before he could even find words for the sight of her, "when a warrior chooses a mate, she does not wait to be asked. She claims him if he is willing, and she marks that claim so the whole world knows it. I have decided you are the one I am claiming, orchard man. I would know if that frightens you before I go any further." "It does not frighten me," he said, though his heart was hammering hard enough that he suspected she could hear it. "I have been yours since before I knew what to call it, Snaga. Claim away." What she did then, in the warm dark of his small cottage with the apple trees whispering outside the window, was tender in a way that surprised him, for all her fierce reputation, patient where he had expected only hunger, though the hunger was there too, banked like a coal beneath careful hands. She traced the old scars on his shoulders left by a decade of mercenary work, and told him, in a voice gone soft and unguarded, that she found nothing in him lacking, that his years of walking away from the sellsword's life had not made him less of a warrior in her eyes but more of one, because it took a harder kind of courage to choose peace after tasting war than to simply keep swinging a blade out of habit. He learned the shape of her in return, the old scars mapped across her ribs and shoulders like a history written in a language only she could fully translate. And when at last they came together, it was with a slow, deliberate intimacy that left no doubt in him at all that she had meant every word of her claiming. Afterward she lay curled against his side with one strong arm thrown possessively across his chest, and murmured against his shoulder, half asleep, that she had never once in her life imagined wanting to stay still with anyone, and that staying still with him felt, unaccountably, like exactly where she belonged. He did not sleep that night, not really, too full of a happiness he did not quite trust yet to close his eyes against, and simply lay there in the dark memorizing the sound of her breathing. Their bond did not go unremarked. Word traveled fast in a town as small as Thornwatch, and faster still through the network of trade routes that connected the border settlements, and it was not many days before both the town and the Stonejoe clan itself had opinions about a human orchard man and an orc wall warden choosing each other so openly. The town's reaction was mixed but softening, especially after weeks of watching Snaga labor alongside them raising a wall to protect their own children, sweat and blood spent visibly and generously in their defense. Even Magistrate Ash, grudging as ever, had taken to nodding to her in the market rather than glaring, though he would never quite call it friendship. The clan's reaction arrived in the person of a young Stonejoe warrior named Krev, sent by Chief Thok himself to question whether Snaga's judgment had been compromised by what he called, with poorly hidden distaste, her human attachment. He arrived at the half-finished wall on a gray morning with two other warriors at his back, and found Snaga atop the new watchtower frame, directing the placement of a support beam with Gideon working the winch below. "Ironhide," Krev called up, "Chief Thok sends me to ask whether you intend to return to Stonejoe lands when this wall is finished, or whether you mean to abandon your clan for a human's bed." The insult landed clean and cruel, meant to be heard by every ear on that construction site, and Gideon felt his hands tighten on the winch rope even as he forced himself to hold his tongue, trusting Snaga to answer in her own way. She descended the tower frame with unhurried grace, axe already loose in her grip, and stood before Krev with the easy, terrible calm of a woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to make a threat land. "You may tell Chief Thok," she said, "that I have not abandoned anything. I am rebuilding the very wall my oath as wall warden requires me to rebuild, and I am doing it beside the man I have chosen to claim, which is a right every Stonejoe warrior has held since before your grandmother's grandmother was born. If Chief Thok has a quarrel with my choice, he may come and voice it himself, orc to orc, instead of sending a boy barely past his first blooding to insult me on a construction site." Krev's face darkened, pride stung, and his hand drifted toward the axe at his own hip. "Perhaps I will make him answer for it myself then. A duel, Ironhide, to settle whether you are still fit to hold your warden's title, or whether human comforts have softened you past usefulness." "Careful, boy," Snaga said, and there was no more warmth in her voice at all now, only the flat, dangerous edge of a warrior being tested and finding the test beneath her. "I have killed 6 Bloodfang raiders with these hands in a single night, while your chief slept safe behind Stonejoe's own walls. Draw that axe if you truly wish to learn whether human comforts have softened me." For a long, taut moment it seemed the challenge might be answered in blood right there on the half-finished construction site, and Gideon stepped forward not to fight, for he knew this was not his battle to fight for her, but to stand visibly at her shoulder, a silent declaration that whatever came, she would not face it alone. It was that, in the end, that made Krev lower his hand. Not fear of Snaga's blade, though he clearly respected it, but something in the sight of the two of them standing together, unshaken, that told him plainly this quarrel would gain him nothing but a wasted duel and a story that would not flatter him in the telling. "I will carry your words to the chief," Krev said stiffly, and turned his warriors back toward the forest road, though not without one last glance back at Gideon, equal parts suspicion and grudging assessment, the look of a man revising an opinion he had not expected to need to revise. When they were gone, Snaga let out a long breath and rolled her shoulders, some of the coiled tension easing out of her frame, and Gideon reached out to rest a hand against the small of her back, an unspoken question. "I am well," she told him, softer now. "Krev is young and proud and afraid of what my choice says about the old ways bending. He will learn or he will not, but either way I meant what I told him. I have chosen you, Gideon Sutton, and I do not unchoose easily." "I know," he said, and found to his own surprise that he believed it completely. The wall rose slowly through the turning of the season, stone by stone and beam by beam, and with it rose something in Thornwatch itself, a cautious, hard-won hope that the ironwood truce might yet survive the wound Mordrek's scarn had torn into it. But hope, on a frontier border, is a fragile thing, and the Bloodfang chief was not finished testing how far that wound could be widened. The warning came from an unexpected source, a Stonejo scout who arrived at the half-finished wall 3 months after the siege, breathless from a hard ride, bearing news that Mordrek had gathered a larger warband than before, nearly 40 raiders strong, and meant to strike the wall again before its completion could stand as proof the truce still held. He meant, the scout said, to finish this time what he had started, to burn the gate before its stones were even fully set, and to leave no survivors at all this time to tell the tale. Gideon and Snaga stood together atop the nearly finished watchtower that evening, looking out over the darkening tree line where, somewhere beyond the reach of torchlight, a warband was gathering to try to undo everything they had spent months rebuilding with their own hands. "We cannot hold 40 raiders with the militia Thornwatch can muster," Gideon said, running the grim arithmetic aloud. "Not with the gate only half hung and the eastern rampart still unfinished." "No," Snaga agreed. "But we do not have to hold them alone." She turned to him, something fierce and decided in her eyes. "I will send word to Chief Thok myself. Whatever Krev thinks of me, Thok is not so foolish as to let the Bloodfang burn a truce wall unanswered, not when it threatens every clan bound by that same treaty. And you will rally every soul in Thornwatch who can hold a spear, orchard man. Between Stonejaw warriors and human militia both, we may yet give Mordrek Skarn a fight he does not expect." It was a plan built on hope as much as strategy, and both of them knew it, but there was nothing else to be done. And so the next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic preparation, forging spearheads in the town's smithy, digging sharpened stakes into the unfinished eastern approach, sending riders both to Stonejaw territory and to the nearest human garrison for whatever aid could arrive in time. The attack came on the 4th night, under a moon thin as a blade's edge, and it was every bit as savage as the scout had warned. Mordrek Skarn's warband hit the unfinished eastern rampart first, exactly where Gideon and Snaga had feared they would, pouring over the half-raised stonework with torches and screaming war cries. And for a terrible, chaotic hour, it seemed the defense would simply be overrun. Thornwatch militia and the handful of Stonejaw warriors who had arrived in time fighting a desperate, grinding battle in the flickering dark. Gideon fought at the gate itself, holding the choke point with a knot of townsmen he had drilled for 3 frantic days, his old sellsword instincts fully awake now, calling orders with a steadiness that surprised even him. Snaga fought the eastern breach, her axe a blur of motion, cutting down raider after raider, but even her fury could not be everywhere at once, and it was there in the chaos of that breach that Mordrek Skarn himself finally found his way to her again. "Ironhide," he roared, blood-slicked and grinning, "I told you broken things do not mend. Tonight I prove it." Their duel was brutal and fast, axe against cleaver, 2 proud warriors who had already tested each other once before and knew exactly how dangerous the other truly was. Snaga fought with everything she had, but Mordrek was larger and fresher, and he had brought a warband 3 times the size of the one that had burned the gate the first time, and slowly, inexorably, he began to press her back toward the unfinished rampart's edge. Gideon saw it from across the yard, saw the moment Mordrek's cleaver caught Snaga's axe and wrenched it from her grip, saw the raider chief raise his blade for a killing blow, and something in him simply stopped thinking and started moving, cutting through the melee with a desperation that ignored every wound he took along the way. He reached her a half-second before the blade fell, throwing himself bodily into Mordrek's strike, and the cleaver that had been meant for Snaga's skull opened a deep, terrible gash across Gideon's shoulder and chest instead, driving him to the ground in a spray of blood and pain so sudden and total that the world went white at its edges. The sound Snaga made was not a warrior's battle cry. It was something rawer than that, something torn from a place far beneath pride or strategy, and what she did to Mordrek's Skarn in the next several seconds, unarmed, bare-handed, driven by a fury that had nothing left of calculation in it, ended the Bloodfang chief's life before he ever fully understood what had happened to him. She was at Gideon's side before his blood had finished spreading across the frozen ground, her hands pressing hard against the wound, her voice cracking as she shouted for a healer, for anyone, her composure, so carefully maintained through months of siege and rebuilding and quiet courtship, shattering completely at the sight of him bleeding out beneath her. "Do not you dare," she said, fierce and broken all at once. "Do not you dare leave me after everything, Gideon Sutton. I forbid it. Do you hear me? I forbid it." "Bossy," he managed, through gritted teeth, and the sound that tore out of her was half a sob and half a furious, disbelieving laugh, and she held his wound closed with both hands and did not let go, not even when the battle around them finally, gradually, began to turn. With Mordrek dead and their chief's body left broken on the unfinished rampart, the remaining Bloodfang raiders broke and scattered into the tree line, harried by the arrival, at last, of Stonejoe reinforcements led by Chief Thok himself, who had ridden through the night the moment word reached him that a truce wall was under siege. The battle that had threatened to undo 3 months of careful rebuilding ended, in the end, in a victory bought at a price that would leave its mark for the rest of both their lives. Gideon survived. It was close, closer than Snaga would ever fully forgive the world for allowing, and the wound left a deep, ropey scar across his shoulder and chest that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his days. But he survived, tended through a fevered week by a Stonejoe healer that Chief Thok himself had sent, and by Snaga, who did not leave his bedside for longer than it took to relieve herself for nearly the whole of that terrible week. The bittersweet cost of that night fell elsewhere, in a place neither of them had expected. Chief Thok, standing over Mordrek Skarn's body in the gray dawn light 2 days after the battle, had made his judgment plain to every warrior gathered there, Stonejoe and Bloodfang survivors both. The Ironwood truce would hold, he declared, and any clan or warrior who broke it as Mordrek had broken it would answer for it as Mordrek had answered for it, with their life. But he had also looked at Snaga Ironhide, standing exhausted and blood-streaked with her human beside her, and had made a second judgment that cut deeper than any blade. "You chose a human's bed over your clan's council," Thok said, not unkindly, but with the heavy finality of a chief bound by old law he could not simply set aside, even for a warrior he respected. "Krev's report reached me before this battle did. I do not condemn your heart, Ironhide. I have seen what you did on that rampart. I have seen the man you nearly died defending, but the law of Stonejoe is clear. A warrior who claims a mate outside the clan may keep that mate, but she may not keep her warden's title, nor her place among the clan's council fires. You must choose now, before every warrior gathered here, which life you intend to live." It was, Gideon understood later, a kind of mercy dressed in the shape of a punishment, Thok's own quiet way of honoring both the old law and the plain, undeniable courage he had witnessed. But it was a mercy that still asked Snaga Ironhide to give up everything she had been before the siege had ever burned that first gate. Her title, her clan's fires, the only home she had known since she was a girl too small to lift the axe she now wielded so masterfully. She did not hesitate as long as Gideon feared she might, though he could see, in the tightness around her eyes, exactly how much the choice cost her. "Then I choose," she said, loud enough to carry across the whole gathered assembly, her hand finding Gideon's and gripping it hard enough to ground them both. "I have spent my whole life being told what a warrior owes her clan. I have paid that debt in full, Chief Thok, in blood at that wall more than once now. What I owe myself, I have only just learned to claim, and I will not set it down again for anyone, not even you." She looked at Gideon then, and something in her face, fierce and unguarded and entirely certain, made his throat ache. "I am Snaga Ironhide, and I am no longer Stonejaw's wall warden. I am Thornwatch's now if they will have me, and I am his if he will have me, and I would not trade this choice back for every council fire in Stonejaw territory." Chief Thok studied her for a long moment, something that might almost have been pride moving behind his weathered eyes, and inclined his head, formal and final. "Then go in peace, Ironhide, though not as Stonejaw's warden any longer. You leave with my respect, if not my law's blessing." Few warriors I have known would have chosen so plainly, with so much to lose. It was a wound, that loss, real and lasting, the kind that does not simply heal because a happier ending waits on the other side of it. Snaga grieved it in quiet moments over the weeks that followed, staring out at the forest road that led toward the home she could no longer claim, and Gideon never once tried to tell her that grief away, only sat with her through it, his hand in hers, understanding better than most men could exactly what it cost to set down an old life for a new one worth building. The wall was finished at last in the first cold days of true winter, nearly 5 months after the night it had first burned, and the whole of Thornwatch turned out to see the final stone set into the new gate arch, the same arch where Gideon and Snaga had fought back to back through the worst night of both their lives. Magistrate Ash himself, grudging no longer but something closer to grateful, presided over the small ceremony, and it was Snaga's hand, alongside Gideon's, that set the final capstone into place, sealing the arch above the gate that would stand, they hoped, for generations to come as proof that the ironwood truce could survive even the worst that hatred and fire could throw against it. "They will tell this story wrong within a generation," Snaga said afterward, standing with Gideon atop the finished watchtower as the sun set gold and quiet over a wall that no longer smelled of smoke, only of fresh-cut timber and mortar still curring in the cold air. "They will say a human hero rebuilt this wall, or an orc warrior defended it, and they will forget it took both of us together to raise even a single stone of it." "Let them tell it wrong," Gideon said, drawing her against his side, his scarred shoulder aching pleasantly in the cold the way it always would now, a permanent reminder of the night he had chosen her over his own safety without a moment's hesitation. "We will know the truth of it. That is enough for me." She turned in his arms, tusks catching the last of the sunset light, her dark eyes soft in a way that only he in all the world ever got to see. "I lost my clan for this," she said, quiet, not quite a complaint, more a truth she still needed sometimes to say aloud so it did not curdle silently in her chest. "I lost the fires I grew up beside, the title I bled years to earn. I want you to know that I do not regret it, Gideon Sutton, not for one single moment, but I want you to know what it cost, so that you understand exactly how much you are worth to me." "I know what it cost," he said, low, his hand coming up to cradle her scarred, beautiful face. "I watched you pay it in front of your whole clan without flinching, and I will spend every day I have left trying to make sure you never once regret the price." "You already have," she said, and kissed him there atop the finished wall, unhurried and certain, while below them the town of Thornwatch lit its lanterns against the coming dark, safe behind stone that human and orc hands had raised together, out of fire, out of grief, out of a love neither of them had gone looking for and both of them now could not imagine living without. They built a life together in the seasons that followed, in the little cottage among the apple trees, where an orchard man had once believed he would live out his days entirely alone, content with quiet and cider, and the slow, patient work of growing something instead of ending it. Snaga took up a new title before the following spring, not Wall Warden any longer but Thornwatch's own Warden of the Gate, the first orc to hold such a post among the human settlements. A position Magistrate Ash himself, of all people, had proposed before the whole town council, a quiet, grudging tribute to a debt he knew the town could never fully repay her. She never stopped being fierce. She never stopped challenging Gideon to contests she usually won, never stopped meeting the world with the same proud, unshakable confidence that had first caught his eye atop that wall 18 months before the siege. But there was a softness in her now too, one she let no one else see, reserved entirely for quiet evenings in the orchard, for the man who had bled beside her at that gate and had never once let her stand alone in the worst of it since. Word of what had happened at Thornwatch traveled far along the border in the seasons that followed, and slowly, cautiously, it began to change something larger than just one small frontier town. Other joint garrisons along the Ironwood border took heart from the story, human and orc soldiers standing their posts a little more steadily, a little more willing to trust the warrior beside them regardless of what blood ran in their veins, because Thornwatch had proven, in fire and stone, and a love no one had expected, that the old hatred was not the only inheritance either people had to offer each other. Late one evening, nearly a year after the siege that had taken so much from both of them, Gideon found Snaga sitting on the wall's watchtower as she often did at dusk, looking out over the dark tree line toward the home she could not return to. "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" he asked her, settling beside her, the old question he still sometimes needed to ask, though he already knew by now exactly what her answer would be. She reached over and laced her fingers through his, rough and strong and entirely sure, and looked at him with the same fierce, open certainty she had shown him first the night she claimed him, unafraid then and unafraid now of exactly how much she wanted him. "I chose a home instead of a title," she said. "I chose you instead of a clan fire I can still see burning some nights, if I let myself look too long. I will grieve what I lost until I die, Gideon Sutton. That is simply true, and I will not pretend otherwise, not even to comfort you. But I would make that same choice again in every single life I might ever live, without hesitating once, because you were worth every single thing I set down to have you. That is not a wish for something different. That is the truest thing I have ever known." He kissed her then, on the wall they had rebuilt together out of ashes and grief, and a rivalry that had turned, against every expectation either of them once held, into the deepest love either of them had ever known. And below them, Thornwatch settled into a peaceful winter night, safe and whole, guarded by a gate that stood as a lasting testament to the only warrior who had survived its burning, and the man who had refused from the very first terrible morning to let her face the world alone.